Everybody likes a scary story, unless it's their story, in which case they may be scared to tell it, for fear they'll get it wrong or go on too long or, God forbid, be boring. And because I'm no different, I hesitate. Okay, here goes. "1980, sun-drenched courtyard at the University of Colorado. Fountains gurgling, students chatting, preening. Oh my God, the pheromones on the breeze. Shattered by the clatter of the coming of the Lord. A sidewalk preacher. Jesus forgives your sins. But what about the sin of rupturing a perfect scene? When someone more clever academically objects, quote your sources. I recognize the wise guy from class. A week later, we're studying at the same library table. We're both returning students, we discover, New Yorkers who came out west. We end up becoming friends and sometimes housemates. Atmospheric CO2, 335 parts per million. 1984, Mark and I graduate. He goes off to be a rock star. I head off to be a travel writer. In 1988, I'm sweating on a bicycle. Mark's perspiring on stage at CBGB's. It's a scorching summer, and Dr. James Hansen, the head of NASA's Goddard Space Science Center, asks for the windows to be opened at the U.S. Congress so they'll sweat as he tells them climate change is happening now. The UN creates the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Thousands of scientists from 195 member countries are involved. Atmospheric CO2, 352 parts per million. 1996, Mark's still flogging the music, but he applies for a PhD program at Penn State. The department head there plays mandolin. He hopes Mark will want to start a band. I get my master's in hydrology so I can do development work on the border, help communities build water and wastewater projects. Atmospheric CO2 is 362 parts per million. In 1998, Mark follows up on a hunch from his advisor, Kate Freeman, develops a new proxy for analyzing CO2 levels from ancient rocks. His first paper comes out in Nature. You've heard of Nature, usually right after the words, "A new study in Nature revealed." Yeah, that Nature, the world's most famous scientific journal, the one where if you publish, it's a career achievement. Mark's just getting started. I'm showing inmates of a Mexican jail how to make bird feeders from gourds grown on treated sewage. Atmospheric CO2, 367 parts per million. By 2007, the world is catching on, though. The Oscar for Best Documentary goes to Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth. But, as Harvard science historian Naomi Oreskes documents, there's an industry now employed to dispute their findings. In 2009, hackers selectively released correspondence stolen from East Anglia and Penn State researchers to throw shade on Michael Mann's hockey stick graph, the one that shows the 20th century is the warmest in the last 1,000 years, and that things warm dramatically after 1920. Approaching the present day, they sweep upward like the blade of a hockey stick. Atmospheric CO2, 385 parts per million. It's 2010. Mark writes a proposal that creates the Yale Climate and Energy Institute. They hire Rajendra Pachauri, the head of the IPC, as their first director. I'm running a kayak company on the Rio Grande, trying to demonstrate that the river is safe for paddling. The Mexican government declares war on the cartels, as if I didn't have enough of a challenge. 2013, Mark finagles me a job as his communications director at Yale. That he is my best friend, nobody needs to know. I feel like a total imposter, but Mark feels I belong. He must, right? I interview scientists, translate their research into something others can understand. But first, I've got to understand it, which means going back to secondary school, chemistry and physics. The periodic table of the elements to understand isotope geochemistry. A bit of astronomy to understand Milankovitch cycles. There's lots of ground to make up. I impersonate someone who belongs. Atmospheric CO2, 393 parts per million. Through an op-ed he wrote for CNN, I begin to appreciate Mark's academic fame as the authority on the history of carbon dioxide for the last 55 million years. A bit niche, you say? 55 million years is just a slice of geologic time? Yes, but one that embodies climatic swings great enough to allow for giant reptiles at the North Pole. It's remarkable what scientists know about that period called the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. It's even more interesting what they don't. Did CO2 drive recent ice ages, or did the ice ages drive CO2? The uncertainty doesn't refute our understanding, but exemplifies how science moves forward, like the glaciers we study. I learned that the notion of a greenhouse effect is hardly new. In 1895, Svante Arrhenius, Sweden's first Nobel laureate, predicted CO2 levels would heat the Earth's atmosphere. And is anyone surprised to discover that decades previously, a woman, Eunice Foote, suggested it first? It's not until the 1950s, however, before someone actually starts checking on CO2. Charles Keeling develops a method for analyzing atmospheric gases. Launching balloons from atop Mauna Loa, the world's largest volcano 2 miles high in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, the numbers reflect how oxygen levels rise as northern hemisphere forests leaf out every spring, then fall when their leaves decompose. It's like the Earth breathing, in and out, once a year, creating a perfect sawtooth pattern, except it's creeping up. 2022, 180 years since Eunice Foote hypothesized a climate crisis is possible. 70 years after rising CO2 levels were confirmed underway. A decade after thousands of scientists agreed that Earth's rising temperatures were 100% due to man's greenhouse emissions. And where does that leave us in terms of dealing with it? Divided and uninformed. This headline references a study that determined climate deniers were slightly more scientifically literate than people who cared passionately about the subject, by just 1%, and both groups got failing grades. And check this out, a study from the National Center for Social Research that shows a majority of 18 to 34-year-olds don't understand that climate change is primarily man-made. The percentages drop further in other demographics. How can we hope to collectively change the behaviors that will ameliorate the challenges ahead when none of us know what we're talking about? Clearly, it's time to call in the poets. Here's the first one we called, Dr. Robin Lamboll.
This is Dirac. He united special relativity with quantum mechanics, but he says that science is about making difficult things simple. Poetry is to make simple things incomprehensible. He's not always wrong, but I would like to point out that I'm a spoken word artist. Now, this is important because it means you can't reread lines that I've said, so they have to be understandable first time or they were pointless. Also, I'm physically here, so you can talk to me after the show, and if it turns out that that profound sounding thing was actually just me trying to sound clever, you can punch me in the face. This is useful in terms of communicating science because you can use rhythm and rhyme to keep people's attention through complicated things. That being said, this next poem does also have explanatory diagrams. It's called Sea Anemone. Some cells see anemones as being their enemies, but several sorts of algae are hardly separate entities. They, in a process called endosymbiosis, live inside their hostess, closeness without protest, swapping their sweet sugars for the safe seats it delivers, protected by these toxic spines if they should need assistance. But this curious pedigree found inside the anemone goes another layer deeper. See, the algae all are Russian dolls that once ate other algae that hold chloroplasts, which in the past lived on their own. These now harmless creatures back then were known as cyanobacteria and caused such hysteria when first they fouled the earth with this toxin that we call oxygen. Highly reactive. It found life, attacked it. The bodies piled higher till we learned to respire. What was waste was endorsed and was made a resource. Now we breathe these exhaust fumes and almost all consume food made by these awesome bacterial communes, because not all were digested. Some just arrested inside a cell, where in good health they still photosynthesize, barely realize as feeder and fowler become one alga inside another alga, inside an anemone, and living in and around this could be a clownfish. And they're all trying to kill each other. Remember, these sea anemones don't dance purely by chance, and they're not plants. They're poison-stinging, paralysis or death-bringing animals. Only Nemo's immune to their sting harpoon. His mucus coat means he can gloat safe from predation, luring snacks into his own habitation, because phenomenally, this lemony green anemone seems cleaned by a nominally prey species as they both breathe poison oxygen from within. It seems home is where you're immune to the neurotoxin. Thank you.
UK slam poet champion Dr. Robin Lambole says poets lack authority. Even he, an Imperial College physicist and IPCC contributor, finds it helpful to present infographics to frame his poetry. As homework in an early workshop, he told everyone to find one. Martin Sanderson, the former house poet at Passing Clouds, returned with this.
We're all aware we need to change the way we eat. For different forms of protein, we must hustle. But surprising a source with the lowest carbon footprint is the humble bivalve mussel. It's really dope. It hangs off a rope. It has very simple needs. It bottom filters residue and just sits there and feeds.
And so was born the idea for a poetry slam, specifically for scientifically informed poems under 3 minutes in length that reference infographics like the ones in this presentation. We've got £800 total to award, with the first 150 going to the top 3 finishers at a qualifying tournament December 8th. That's next week. Those 3 automatically enter in the final competition in early 2023 to compete for the remaining £650, along with an additional 12 poems chosen from people who have submitted online before the end of the year. This workshop, held December 1st, was one of a series designed to help formulate entries in the slam. Poets du jour were Lucifer Morningstar Christ and rapper Solar Flight, and they were accompanied by science guy Dr. Eddie Muscat. Excerpts from their discussion and sample poems which resulted follow.